And here is a book. Some of you might have heard about this book or maybe about similar types of books. So the title, as you can see, is Weapons of Math Destruction. The subtitle, which you may or may not be able to read, is How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. So with algorithms, with big data, with AI, with computing in general, there has been concern about its effects on society and effects on things like equality and equity and societal institutions. This is something that AI is certainly playing a large role in, but it's wider than AI. So in the talk today, we'll focus a lot of things on AI in particular, but also look a little bit more broadly. So what are books like this about? What is their main points? What are some of their themes? What are some of the things that they bring out that they're particularly concerned about? And in general, some questions on this topic are things like, what is algorithmic fairness? How is AI involved? What are some of the important basic things to know about these topics? And why can this topic be complicated? Why isn't it something that we can say, okay, yeah, there's a problem here. All we need to do is be a little bit more attentive and solve it. So here is the agenda for today. After this quick introduction, we'll do some basics on ethics, do a little bit of background, do an exercise on the topic of fairness, do a little bit of summary, and then there should be some time, 10 minutes or so at the end for just any questions you have. And in terms of the goals, what I'd like you to be able to do after this is to be able to explain some reasons why algorithmic fairness is an issue, some ways that AI is involved, some of the basics, relate this topic to your areas and your interests, and also be able to explain why these issues can be complicated. So the first thing that I'd like to do is let's try to relate this to your field. And let's dig into some of these things in a little bit more detail. Okay. And here, this is a quote from an article from about 8 years ago. And this particular article, it actually made quite a splash at the time. Now, before we get to it, I'd actually like to point out from 8 years ago, if you think about, for instance, when ChatGPT burst upon the scene, that was fall of 22. So AI does have a history that predates, of course, ChatGPT. AI has a long and interesting history. So some of the issues that we're seeing right now were actually present before ChatGPT. But in some ways, things like ChatGPT, large language models, have intensified or have added new issues. But I'd like to focus on this particular article for a few things here. So as you can see by the quote here, they're talking about a particular system called Compass. This was being used by judges in courtrooms as a tool for trying to figure out how long of a sentence to give to people that were indicted or that were charged and then convicted of a criminal offense. So one of the questions the judges often have to confront is how long of a sentence to give to people. And so they're using this tool, and this ProPublica article was saying that this is biased. Now, this is an example of what the article is calling an automated decision-making system. So this is a typical AI system, not a large language model, but a different kind of system, but one that is very important in trying to help people make decisions on important issues that are going to affect people and maybe affect society as well. And as you can see, the quote here, this is not restricted just to criminal justice system issues. So credit scoring algorithms, mortgage, credit cards, cell phone deals, and a lot of other things. So what I'd like to do now is to go to a breakout room and let's think about these sorts of issues. And here are 3 questions. Discuss as many of them as you have time for in the breakout room. And let's go for about 5 minutes for this breakout discussion. So the 3 questions here, have you heard of any other specific examples on this type of issue with algorithmic fairness? Can you think of any ways that they occur in the field or fields that you're in? And What are some possible sources that can contribute to this unfairness? Where does unfairness come in here? If we think about it in terms of development or think about it in terms of use of these systems. So let's pick up on a few of the things, though. And one of the questions was on possible sources of errors. And there are a number of different errors. So this is one of the reasons why things can be complicated. You can have errors coming in, for instance, from incorrect data or from other data issues. If any of you have ever worked with large databases, you've probably seen that the data is rarely entirely accurate. And some of the time there are some fairly significant errors. There are other things, though, like the data not being representative. So you may have seen examples of, say, medical studies where they have done a study, but the study doesn't have a broad representation in it. Okay, so it might have been studies just on one very small subpopulation, and then they're trying to extrapolate their findings to the general public. And that doesn't always work. So they need to be very careful on that. If we even think about things like large language models, what are large language models being trained on, or what have they been trained on? Well, they've been trained to a large extent on what's out on the internet or what's publicly available online. And if you think about that, well, there are some areas that are overrepresented there and some areas that are underrepresented there. For instance, English is the dominant language. Now, there's a fair amount of input from a number of other countries as well, a number of other languages, but there are some that are definitely not represented as much as is warranted. So there are various sorts of data issues. There are various sorts of model issues. So if you look at things like parameter choices within models, if you think about how things are weighted within a model, the various input factors, think about models that might be poorly designed. And then there are interpretation type of errors as well. So for instance, there might be some spurious correlations. There might be various ways of misinterpreting the data. So those of you that work with data a lot know that there are some things that, for instance, might be counterintuitive unless you think about them carefully. For instance, Simpson's paradox is that if there is a characteristic that applies to all the groups within a data set, does it apply to the entire data set? And the answer to that is no. So for Simpson's paradox, for example, suppose you've got two softball players. Softball player A has an average that's higher than softball player B in the first half of the season, as well as in the second half of the season. Does that necessarily imply that softball player A's average over the entire season is higher than softball player B's? And it doesn't. There are some cases where B's average might be higher than A's. I'll invite you to think about that. And we can talk about that in the Q&A more if anybody is interested. But there are these various sorts of interpretation errors as well. And there are various use errors. So using in unexpected or unwarranted context, use errors based upon, well, you've got to make some threshold choices. So sometimes that introduces errors. Deciding whether to weigh false positives, false negatives, a lot of things like that. Okay, another perspective on background is let's think about some views that people have on computing, on AI, and on decision making. So for instance, there are some people that say that computers are smart, therefore let's just turn all the decision making over to them. They'll do a better job than we do. There are some people that'll say that, well, technology is neutral, so algorithms are neutral, so therefore they must be fair. Okay, and you might think of some problems with each of these statements. There are some people that say algorithms will always contain at least some bias. As we saw in the previous slide, there's a variety of ways for bias or errors to come in. And so we should not let algorithms make any decisions involving people. Only people should make those. There are some people that say, yes, algorithms can be biased, but to address this question, all we need is for developers to be more careful and just realize there's bias, just avoid the bias. And then there's some people that say algorithms can be biased. To address this problem, we need people constructing the algorithms to identify what is fair and just make sure the algorithm fulfills that fairness criterion. So that's somewhat similar to the last one, but a little more specific. Now, none of these views is complete. There's a little bit of truth to each of them, but there's also some deficiencies to each of them. So why is that? Why is this a complicated error? So here's one reason. Let's go back to that article. And here's another quote from it. One of the things is that for large systems, they're either complicated enough or there's a lot of things going on the under the hood that we don't know about, as this quote brings out for the ADM or for the compass system. But this is even more true for, say, large language models. And then another reason why this is complicated is illustrated by this quote. So again, with that ProPublica article, the compass system, you've got the company, and then you've got some data researchers saying, well, actually, the company is right. The journalist misinterpreted the data. So did the journalist misinterpret the data or not? And as you can see, the punchline, the bottom line there is, okay, who's right? Well, they all are. Now, how can that be? So let's do an exercise that'll sort of answer that question indirectly. So here's the exercise. Let's suppose that you are in charge of a large amount of funds for increasing the speed of internet in a city. Then the city's got two parts, an eastern part and a western part. And at present, the internet speed in the eastern part is faster than that in the western part. You've also got more people living in the eastern part and the western part. And you're given four different ways to possibly spend this large amount of money to increase the internet speed for at least some people. And here are the four choices. First of all, suppose you wanted to maximize the average speed. Well, it turns out that if you give all the money to the east, it's already got the larger internet speed, but it turns out that if you spend all the money on the east, you are going to increase the average speed. And you're also going to give a majority of the city inhabitants a speed increase because the majority live in the east. But this is going to increase the disparity between east and west. Second option is let's spend an equal amount per person. And let's assume that'll increase everyone's speed the same amount, but keep the disparity the same. Third option is let's spend the same amount on the east side as on the west side. That's going to retain some disparity. However, since fewer people live in the western side, each of them will get a larger amount. So the result is it's going to decrease the disparity, but not eliminate it entirely. The fourth option is eliminating the disparity entirely by spending all the money on the west, none on the east. And so the question then is, which of these would you choose? So if we can have the poll open now, we'll try to do this as a poll. So choose the option that you think is the most fair.
Does everyone see the poll? I just launched it.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay, if you're still thinking about it, take a few more seconds and then submit your answer here. So we did that. So let's go back to the breakout groups. And what I'd like you to talk about in your breakout group was, why did you see your choice as being the best one? And also, if everybody in your group is in agreement, then think about what would be the worst choice and see if you're also in agreement on that. Let's take about 4 or 5 minutes and go to the breakout groups and discuss this one. And one of the takeaways from that is, what do we mean by fair? So even though the majority of people said they would choose option 3, not everybody did. And if you talked about it in your group, you might have heard some good reasons why some people thought the other options were good options, were more fair than option 3. So one of the things that people that look at this area in detail point out is there are different measures of fairness. And on one hand, this shouldn't be too surprising. For instance, if we think about medical tests, Do we want to minimize, say, false positives of a test, or do we want to minimize false negatives? You usually can't minimize both of them simultaneously. Okay. So with algorithms, there are different measures of fairness. With AIs, there are different measures of fairness. If you think about things like using AI for facial recognition, that same question comes up. Do you want to minimize false positives? Do you want to minimize false negatives? Do you want to minimize some other measure? Okay, so there's not just one thing that we can focus on and say, this is going to be always fair in all situations. Now, if we look at this more broadly, some other takeaway points is, okay, algorithms can be biased. And that shouldn't surprise us. So just replacing human decision making by algorithmic decisions doesn't magically eliminate all bias. And bias can come in a number of places, as we saw before. It can be on the data set, it could be on design decisions, it could be on the use. So it shouldn't really be a surprise if we think about it. On the other hand, we don't want to just adopt a viewpoint of, well, let's just give up entirely and humans are in charge of all the decisions, because as humans, sometimes we're good with making decisions, but some of the time we're not. Some of the time we're biased, even unconsciously. Some of the time we just don't know a lot about a situation. So there's at least the hope that these AI or automatic decision-making systems can at least help produce better decisions, fairer decisions. And this is an interesting area. It's a complicated area, and it's an area where it's important to know both some of the technical things as well as some of the social issues that are involved. If we go back to the article, the end quote is sort of a pointing that out, that this is something that we do need to talk about as professionals within our fields, but also as a society. And we need stakeholder input as well. So for things like the criminal justice thing, you need lawmakers, you need judges, you also need the public, and you need experts in algorithmic fairness to be able to do things like audit the systems, check the systems, give input as to what is fair, or at least some of the criteria for fairness. And those aren't necessarily easy questions. So there are a variety of ways of trying to address unfairness. And it's the kind of thing where maybe we can't address it entirely, but we want to take steps to eliminate the worst of it and to try to make things as fair as possible. So part of that is just being aware of the issue and the different types of errors. Part of it is being cognizant of how the algorithm can affect the stakeholders, and all the stakeholders. Okay, so not just the people that are developing the system, but the people that are using it, the people that it affects indirectly, et cetera. Now, part of this is just professional conduct, using good system development techniques. Part of it is things like, if it is a system that has these significant effects, then allowing audits or external reviews of it to analyze how fair it is or what some of the shortcomings might be. So just making it as transparent as possible, making it auditable, making results traceable. So here's the input, how do we get to the output? And things like that. And this is a topic that there has been a lot of research done on. There have been a variety of books and articles written on it. If you're interested in more, the Wikipedia page on it is actually pretty good. It's long, but it's got some good points in it. There are also other things like IEEE, one of the professional societies, has got a standard for algorithmic bias consideration. It's a report. It's somewhat long, but again, it does a in-depth look at this topic. So let's do one more breakout room here, and then we will do a quick wrap up and then have some time for question and answer. So here's what I'll invite you to think about, and then we'll go to the breakout groups and you can discuss as many of these as you have time for. So just thinking about everything you've seen today so far, what's one thing that's important or surprising or otherwise noteworthy? The second one, anything particularly surprising? And then the third one is there anything you learned that is particularly relevant to your field or to your other interest? So we'll go to the breakout groups now, and let's do a 3-minute breakout group session. This will be a little bit shorter, but I do want to make sure we've got enough time for a quick wrap up and then for about 10 minutes of question and answer.